I want you to hear me as I speak to you now. My hands are not steady as I say this, and I am not speaking from imagination. My name is Wami, and I come from a small village in the Ashanti region of Ghana, West Africa, and I am telling you this directly, as if I am standing right in front of you. The world of dreams is not just something light or meaningless the way many people think. I learned that early in my life. Even the scriptures show that dreams can carry meaning far beyond what we see with our physical eyes. In Job 33:14-16, it is written that God can speak to people in the night, in dreams, while they are sleeping. And through many parts of the Bible, I saw that people experience spiritual things through dreams, things that were not ordinary at all. But I also need you to understand something clearly. Not every dream comes from God. That is something I had to learn the hard way. Some dreams are warnings, some are attacks, and some are like doors opening into something deeper, something spiritual. In many teachings I later encountered, especially in deliverance circles, repeated dreams where a person is eating or receiving food are often seen as signs of spiritual manipulation. Some say it is like something is being placed into a person's life spiritually, something that can affect them either for good or for harm. That is why many people in spiritual warfare ministries take such dreams very seriously. Because what happens in what people call the spiritual realm does not stay there in isolation. It can begin to show itself in real life, in emotions, in health, in relationships, and in a person's strength or weakness over time. For more than 10 years of my life, I was deeply involved in witchcraft. I am not talking about stories people tell for entertainment or things shown in movies. I am talking about real operations carried out quietly by groups of people in different regions across East Africa, the United States, Europe, and Asia. I was inside that world. I saw it from the inside. And I am speaking now because there is something many Christians do not fully understand. Something that quietly destroys lives without them realizing what is happening. Something that many believers feel but rarely speak about openly. It happens at night when they sleep. It begins with dreams that feel strange but familiar at the same time. These dreams often start in similar ways. In some, a person finds themselves eating food. In others, they experience encounters that feel intimate, even sexual, with people they do not recognize. And the strange part is how real it feels. When they wake up, they feel drained, confused, sometimes ashamed, and often spiritually heavy, as if something has been taken from them. I know this because I was once part of the group responsible for causing such experiences. I was one of the people sent into those operations. And before I go deeper into how people become free from it, I need you to understand how I even entered that world myself. When I was around 17 years old, I was recruited into witchcraft by a family member, my auntie. To people outside, she appeared to be nothing more than a herbalist, someone who worked with traditional medicine. But inside our circle, she had a very different identity. She was known as the keeper of what we called the night gate. That term meant she had authority over spiritual operations that were carried out during sleep. In our understanding, most of the work did not happen in the daytime. It happened in the hours when people were resting, when their awareness was lowered, and when their defenses were believed to be weakest. We were taught that most effective operations happened between around 1:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. That period was considered a deep window of spiritual activity. We believed that during that time, many people were more open to influence, and that is when different experiences would begin to manifest in dreams. That is when people would suddenly start seeing themselves eating food in dreams, or being invited to gatherings, or encountering unfamiliar people. Some would experience being chased, others would be given food by strangers, and some would see relatives who had passed away. To most people, these would just feel like random dreams, but in the system I was part of, we did not see them as random at all. I remember clearly that one of my earliest assignments involved observing and working on targets who were known to be spiritually active. One of them was a man whose life later became an important example of what we did. At that time, I did not fully understand the long-term effects of what we were doing. I only followed instructions, step by step as I was taught. But even then, I began to notice something troubling. The people we targeted often began to change slowly, not suddenly. Their strength would weaken over time. Their consistency in prayer would reduce. Their peace would begin to fade. And many of them never connected those changes to what was happening in their dreams. That was the world I was part of. And at that time, I did not yet understand that I was also stepping into something that would eventually challenge everything I believed about power, control, and spiritual authority. I want you to understand how quickly everything around me deepened after that point. I was no longer just observing, I was being trained inside the system, step by step, into how these night operations were structured. What looked like random experiences to ordinary people were, in my world at that time, treated as organized patterns. One of the first things I was taught was how certain repeated dream patterns were linked to weakening a person gradually. In our understanding, when someone began to experience dreams of eating food, or attending gatherings that felt too real, or encountering familiar faces that did not make sense, it was not treated as random. It was treated as a sign of influence being established over time. I remember how we were told that most people do not resist because they assume dreams are harmless. They wake up, shake it off, and continue their day. But in our operations, that reaction itself was considered an advantage because it meant the pattern could continue without interruption. At that time, I did not yet understand the full spiritual implications of what was being said. I only understood the structure of it. I was told that repeated exposure in dreams could create emotional fatigue, confusion, and distance in a person's spiritual life, especially when they did not recognize what was happening. I also began to see how specific individuals were chosen for these operations. It was never random in the way I once thought. People who were consistent in prayer, or people who had strong spiritual influence in their communities, were often monitored more closely. Their environments were studied, their habits observed, and their vulnerabilities quietly noted. I remember one case very clearly, where a man's consistency in prayer was considered a problem for the group. He prayed every night before sleeping for a long time, and that alone was seen as a barrier. In our discussions, it was said that such consistency created resistance in the dream level, and so additional steps were taken to weaken that resistance over time. At that point, I did not question it deeply. I accepted it as part of what I was being trained in. But something in me slowly started noticing a pattern that I could not ignore. The more consistent a person was in spiritual discipline, the harder it became to maintain any influence over them. It was not immediate, and it was not dramatic. It was gradual. Some attempts failed completely. Others seemed to have no effect at all. And in some cases, things that were expected to progress simply stopped working altogether. This is where I began to feel a kind of internal conflict, even though I did not fully understand it yet. I was still inside the system, still participating, but I was also beginning to see that something about the resistance people had was stronger than what we were prepared for. There was also something else I noticed. The emotional state of a person seemed to matter a lot. People carrying deep emotional pain, unresolved anger, or long-standing bitterness were often easier to influence over time. Not because of external strength or weakness, but because of internal openness that we did not fully understand at the time, only observed in patterns. Everything I am telling you here is from what I personally saw and experienced inside that environment. It was not theory to me then, it was routine. And as I continued deeper into those operations, I would later encounter situations that would completely challenge everything I thought I understood about control, resistance, and spiritual authority. But at that stage, I was still inside it, still learning, still involved, and still unaware of how far it would eventually lead me. One of the cases that stayed in my memory involved a man whose life was being observed over a long period. From the outside, he appeared stable, but in our records at the time, he was considered increasingly difficult to influence. The reason was simple in our analysis. His spiritual discipline was consistent, and his reactions to repeated patterns were not producing the expected outcomes. Attempts were made repeatedly in the form of dream encounters that followed familiar structures, gatherings, meals, and familiar faces. In many cases, people would begin to show changes after such repeated patterns. But in his case, something unusual kept happening. The expected weakening was not sustained. At first, it was assumed that adjustments needed to be made in timing and repetition. But even after changes were made, the outcome did not align with what was expected. This became a point of concern in the group discussions at that time. It was during this period that I first heard a phrase used repeatedly, that some individuals close doors without knowing it. At the time, I did not fully grasp what that meant. I only understood it in terms of resistance patterns, not in deeper spiritual terms. However, as time passed, I began to observe more cases that followed a similar pattern. Not everyone responded the same way to repeated dream activity. Some people appeared unaffected even after multiple attempts. Others showed gradual weakening, and some showed no visible change at all. This inconsistency started to trouble me internally, though I did not express it openly. I was still part of the system, still following instructions, still participating in operations that I did not yet fully question out loud. But something began to shift when I encountered situations where individuals directly resisted what was happening in the dream itself. In our understanding at the time, dreams were considered a space where influence could be maintained if the person remained passive. However, there were rare cases where individuals reacted differently. Instead of following the experience, they would reject it. They would resist it directly within the dream experience itself, and in some cases, the entire structure would collapse immediately. This was something I had not been prepared for. It did not fit the framework I had been taught. It created confusion in our analysis because it suggested a level of authority that we had not accounted for. Around this time, I began to feel that what we understood as control was not as absolute as it had been presented to me. There were limits, and those limits were becoming more visible the more I observed. And slowly, this began to affect how I viewed everything I was part of, even though I was still inside it at the time. As I continued deeper into these experiences, I began to see more clearly that what we called structure and influence had boundaries we could not fully cross. There were individuals whose lives remained unaffected despite repeated attempts, and over time this became impossible to ignore. In our internal discussions, different explanations were given. Some said timing was wrong, others said methods needed adjustment, but none of those explanations fully accounted for what I was witnessing repeatedly. I also began to notice that spiritual practices on the other side, especially among believers, were not as simple as I had previously assumed. Things like prayer, fasting, and certain declarations were discussed in our circles as factors that changed outcomes in ways that were difficult to predict. At first, I treated this as just another variable, but over time I saw patterns that made it harder to dismiss. There were cases where individuals who had been consistent in spiritual discipline showed a level of resistance that disrupted what we expected to happen. This was not immediate in my thinking. It developed slowly as I observed more cases and more inconsistencies. I was still inside the system, still operating within it, but my certainty in its limits was beginning to weaken. There were also moments where I witnessed outcomes that could not be easily explained within the framework I had been taught. Situations would collapse unexpectedly, and attempts that were considered stable would fail without clear cause from our perspective. At that stage, I began to feel something shifting in how I interpreted everything around me. What I once considered fixed began to feel uncertain. What I once considered controlled began to feel conditional. I was still participating, but I was no longer fully aligned in thought. I was observing differently now, and that difference would eventually become the beginning of a much deeper internal change. By the time I reached the later stage of my experience inside that world, I had already seen enough patterns that I could no longer ignore what was happening around me. What we believed to be absolute influence was repeatedly being interrupted by something we did not fully understand. There were individuals who would go through repeated attempts, but instead of weakening, they would eventually break free completely. In some cases, the entire pattern we were working with would collapse suddenly, without warning, and without the expected continuation. One of the most striking moments for me was when I witnessed a case where an individual directly rejected what was happening within the dream experience itself, and the entire structure collapsed instantly. That moment stayed with me because it did not fit anything I had been taught. From that point forward, I began to question more deeply what authority actually meant in that context. I also began to realize that what we were doing was not as stable or absolute as we believed. Over time, I saw more and more examples where the outcomes did not align with expectations. People who were consistent in spiritual discipline were not responding in predictable ways. Some were completely unreachable through methods we relied on. Others recovered in ways that we could not reverse. This created a growing internal tension in me, because I could no longer separate what I was doing from what I was observing. The system I was part of no longer felt fully consistent. And slowly that realization began to change my direction internally. I was still inside it physically, still part of it structurally, but my understanding of it had already started to break apart. What I eventually came to realize was that the authority I had once thought belonged to our side was not what I believed it to be. And that realization became the beginning of my movement away from everything I had been part of until that point. I want to end this by speaking directly to you, as I have been speaking from the beginning. Everything I shared with you is not just about dreams, and it is not just about fear. It is about understanding that what happens in the night does not have to control what happens in your life. I have seen people go through cycles of repeated dreams, confusion, and spiritual pressure, and I have also seen something else very clearly. I have seen that change is possible when people stop being passive and start responding with awareness, discipline, and spiritual authority. What I learned over the years is that many battles are not as random as they feel. There are patterns, there are triggers, and there are doors people open without realizing it. But I also learned something even more important. Those doors are not permanent. They can be closed. What was being influenced can be stopped. What was being repeated can be broken. And I saw this happen again and again. Not by fear, but by response. Not by panic, but by conviction. When people changed how they lived, how they prayed, how they guarded their thoughts, and how they reacted, things shifted. So I want to leave you with this. Do not ignore what you are experiencing, but do not be afraid of it either. Pay attention to your life, strengthen your inner discipline, and take your spiritual life seriously. And if this message has spoken to you in any way, then I want you to do one simple thing right now. Subscribe to the channel, stay connected, and do not miss what is coming next.